On the morning of February 24, 2022, the Russian Federation didn't just invade Ukraine, they executed what military strategists call a combined arms decapitation strike. The plan was textbook perfect, at least on paper. Disable communications, neutralize air defenses, seize the capital, remove the government. Game over in 72 hours. But here's what nobody talks about. Ukraine's victory didn't come from superior tactics or surprise resistance. It came from something far more dangerous. It came from Russia's own success turning into a catastrophic liability. The Russian General Staff had spent months constructing an invasion strategy based on one critical assumption: would own the electromagnetic battlefield. What does that mean? Simple. Once the first missiles hit, Ukrainian radar would go dark. Cell towers would collapse. Radio frequencies would be jammed. Military command networks would fragment into isolated pockets. The Ukrainian government would be cut off from its armed forces. The military would be cut off from its troops, and those troops would be cut off from each other. This isn't theoretical warfare. This is information warfare, and Russia had rehearsed it dozens of times. The first wave of Kalibr cruise missiles and airstrikes was specifically designed to destroy the nerve centers of Ukrainian command and control. Air defense radars, communication hubs, backup power stations, antenna farms, they were all targeted with precision. And here's the brutal truth: it worked. Those missiles hit their targets, many of them, anyway. Ukrainian air defense networks suffered catastrophic damage. Communications infrastructure collapsed in multiple sectors. By 3 a.m. on February 24th, the Russian electronic warfare apparatus had successfully blinded enormous portions of Ukraine's ability to fight. But then something went wrong. Something that Russian military planners had overlooked. Their own success created a problem that would metastasize across the entire invasion force. You see, the Russian military doesn't operate like Western militaries. It's deeply hierarchical. Decisions flow from the top down. Officers wait for orders. Those orders come through command channels. And when those command channels go down, which they did, because Russia had just blown up half the infrastructure Ukraine was using to communicate, something unexpected happened. Russian forces in the field couldn't receive new orders either. The Russian doctrine for rapid airfield seizure required constant communication with higher command. Attack helicopters needed real-time coordinates. Airborne assault forces needed tactical updates. Supply convoys needed routing adjustments. Everything depended on flowing information from Moscow through the chain of command to units on the ground. But Russia's electronic warfare campaign was so comprehensive, so devastating, that it didn't just jam Ukrainian communications. It created a cascading collapse of the entire radio spectrum across the invasion zone. Russian forces began operating blind. This is where the narrative completely diverges from what most people understand. Ukraine didn't defeat Russia through brilliant defensive tactics or hidden reserves. Ukraine won the first 24 hours because Russia's own intelligence apparatus became their worst enemy. Russian special forces units that had infiltrated Kyiv in the days before the invasion found themselves unable to communicate with support elements. They couldn't call for backup. They couldn't coordinate with other teams. They couldn't even report their status to headquarters. When Ukrainian security forces identified and targeted these isolated units, they were essentially fighting ghosts, soldiers with no connection to their command structure, making decisions in a vacuum. The Hostomel airport, one of the most strategically vital pieces of real estate in the entire operation, was supposed to fall within hours. Russian airborne forces were supposed to land there, secure it, and prepare it to receive massive transport aircraft carrying thousands of reinforcement troops. The whole invasion depended on this. But the helicopter assault force that was ordered to seize it, they also couldn't receive updated intelligence about the actual defensive positions. They also couldn't coordinate with the electronic warfare units that were supposed to suppress Ukrainian air defenses in that specific sector. They also arrived at a location that was far more heavily defended than anyone expected, because the intelligence feeding into Moscow's command center had become fragmented and unreliable. What makes this even more devastating is that Russia's military planners didn't account for one psychological reality. When soldiers can't communicate with command, when they don't know if their orders are still valid, when they can't confirm their mission status, they don't fight harder. They fight more cautiously. Some units began withdrawing because they thought they were surrounded. Some waited for orders that never came. Some interpreted the radio silence as a signal to abort their objectives. The Russian airborne regiment that was supposed to establish air superiority over Kyiv instead found themselves fragmenting into smaller groups, each one isolated, each one uncertain. The northern invasion corridor, which was supposed to pour hundreds of kilometers of armor and mechanized infantry toward Kyiv, became a parking lot of lost vehicles. Tank commanders couldn't receive new route assignments. Supply officers couldn't adjust logistics in real time. Mechanized infantry units couldn't coordinate with combat support elements. What was designed as a lightning offensive turned into a grinding, confused mess because the very system Russia had built to dominate the battlefield, their electronic warfare and communications jamming capability, created an information vacuum that affected them just as severely as it affected Ukraine. And here's the twist that almost nobody has adequately explained. Ukraine actually recovered faster. Why? Because Ukraine's military had spent 8 years fighting in Donbass. They had learned to operate without centralized command. They had developed tactics for distributed decision-making. They had trained soldiers to take initiative when command couldn't reach them. Their officers had practiced independence. When the communications infrastructure collapsed, Ukrainian units didn't panic. They reverted to decentralized operations that they had already rehearsed. They operated with more autonomy, made more decisions at the platoon and company level, and coordinated through secondary communication methods that Russia hadn't fully accounted for. The Russian invasion plan assumed that Western militaries and Ukrainian forces would react the same way. They assumed that cutting off central command meant cutting off the entire military. What they didn't account for was that Ukraine had already been fighting a distributed, decentralized war for nearly a decade. The skills that Ukrainian soldiers had developed in the trenches of Donbass, the ability to operate independently, to make tactical decisions without waiting for higher authority, to improvise and adapt, became their greatest asset on February 24th. Meanwhile, Russian forces in the field were experiencing a collapse in coordination that would cascade throughout the entire first week of the operation. The battle for Hostomel airport would turn into a grinding, chaotic back and forth. The drive on Kyiv would slow to a crawl. Logistics would break down because supply columns couldn't receive routing updates. Air support would become sporadic because aircraft couldn't coordinate targets with ground forces. The entire invasion, which was supposed to be a swift decapitation strike, turned into a grinding meat grinder, not because Ukraine was better prepared, but because Russia had blinded itself at the exact moment it needed clear vision most. This is the hidden story that military analysts have been carefully cataloging but not fully explaining. Russia didn't lose to Ukrainian resistance. Russia didn't lose to NATO weapons or American intelligence. Russia lost, at least in the first 24 hours, because its own technological capabilities created a communications catastrophe that its command structure couldn't adapt to quickly enough. The decapitation strike that was supposed to paralyze Ukraine instead created a feedback loop that partially paralyzed the attackers. But this raises a deeper strategic question that we'll explore in the second part of this analysis. If Russia's electronic warfare was so effective that it destroyed their own ability to coordinate, why didn't Russian military planners anticipate this? Why didn't they build in communication redundancies? Why didn't they have backup systems ready? And most importantly, what does this tell us about how modern military invasions actually fail when reality collides with operational plans? The answer lies in what military analysts call the planning paradox. When you design an operation that depends on overwhelming the enemy's ability to communicate and coordinate, you're essentially betting that your own systems will remain untouched by your own weapons. But electronic warfare doesn't distinguish between friend and foe. It's a blunt instrument. Russian planners had assumed, incorrectly, that their military forces would operate in a controlled information environment. They expected to maintain operational channels while degrading Ukrainian ones. They expected their forces to move faster than the chaos they were creating. They expected tactical radio networks to work in conjunction with cellular infrastructure. None of these assumptions survived contact with reality. By dawn on February 24th, Russian airborne units that had been inserted near Hostomel airport northwest of Kyiv were operating almost completely blind. They had landed expecting air superiority, expecting reinforcements to follow within hours, expecting their supporting fires to have degraded Ukrainian defenses. Instead, they found themselves in a ground war they weren't prepared to fight, surrounded by terrain they didn't control, facing Ukrainian forces that had moved into ambush positions during the night. What happened next wasn't a dramatic counteroffensive. It wasn't a coordinated Ukrainian military maneuver. It was something far more dangerous to the Russian operation. It was improvisation fueled by desperation and local knowledge. Territorial defense forces, essentially armed civilians given minimal training, began coordinating their movements through telegram. This is crucial to understand. While Russian forces were trying to use military radio networks that had been partially jammed by their own electronic warfare, Ukrainian defenders were using encrypted civilian messaging apps. Apps that were designed for civilian use, but proved more resilient than traditional military communications in this environment. The irony is almost too perfect. Small groups of Ukrainian fighters began moving toward the airport in the pre-dawn hours. Some traveled by personal vehicles. Some walked, some commandeered buses and trucks. They had no central command directing them. Instead, they had local leaders who understood the terrain, who knew where Russians would likely set up defensive positions, who understood the rhythms of their own neighborhoods better than any military mapmaker ever could. This is where the difference between theoretical warfare and actual warfare becomes visceral. Russian military planners had conducted rehearsals. They had run simulations. They had war-gamed the operation in sanitized command centers, with perfect information and predictable enemy responses. But they hadn't accounted for what happens when 17-year-old Ukrainian kids with hunting rifles and zero formal training start moving through suburban neighborhoods at 3 a.m., with only a telegram chat to coordinate with each other. The Russians had expected to control information. Instead, they found themselves drowning in it, flooded with reports they couldn't verify, contradictory intelligence about Ukrainian positions that may or may not have existed, reports of attacks from directions they hadn't expected, all flowing through communication channels that were partially degraded. By 06 a.m. local time, Russian forces around Hostomel Airport were engaged in firefights with Ukrainian defenders. Not a coordinated military defense, not a planned counteroffensive, just desperate groups of armed Ukrainians who refused to allow Russian transport aircraft to land and disgorge more troops. The larger strategic picture was collapsing in real time. Russian airborne forces, who are among Russia's most elite troops, found themselves pinned down by irregular forces. Their supporting artillery couldn't provide effective fire because of communication failures. Their air support was being challenged in ways they hadn't anticipated. Most critically, their timeline was being destroyed. The operation had been designed with a specific timeline in mind. Day 1 was supposed to secure key objectives. Day 2 was supposed to establish a corridor and bring in reinforcements. Day 3 was supposed to see the advance on Kyiv accelerate, but by the end of Day 1, the entire operation was running 6 to 12 hours behind schedule, with no clear path to catching up. This is something that doesn't get discussed enough in military analysis circles. An operation that slips 12 hours in the first day doesn't just lose 12 hours. It loses the psychological momentum that invading forces depend on. It gives defenders time to organize. It gives local populations time to mobilize. It gives international support time to materialize. And critically, it gives an enemy command structure time to adapt. Ukrainian military leadership, meanwhile, was reacting with remarkable speed. Unlike Russian forces, who were struggling to communicate across their formations, Ukrainian commanders were receiving fragmentary reports and making decisions with whatever information they had. They didn't have perfect intelligence. They didn't have complete situational awareness. But they had something that proved more valuable. They had agency. And they had the ability to act. If you want to understand the full technical breakdown of how Russia's electronic warfare campaign created this cascade of failures, the specific frequencies that were being jammed, the actual NATO intelligence assessments of their capabilities, and the detailed timeline of command failures from battalion level all the way up to General Staff Headquarters, I've put together a comprehensive resource that digs much deeper into the technical and strategic failures. You can find that analysis in the description and the pinned comment. But here's the critical insight that transcends the technical details. Russia had built an operation that required perfect execution. Ukraine, by contrast, had stumbled into a strategy of perfect adaptation. One required all the pieces to work together seamlessly. The other could survive pieces breaking off because it was fundamentally decentralized. By midday on February 24th, it was becoming clear to anyone with tactical awareness that the invasion wasn't proceeding according to plan. Russian forces had failed to establish air superiority. They had failed to neutralize Ukrainian air defenses as quickly as they had planned. They had failed to secure the airspace around Kyiv. And most critically, they had failed to achieve the rapid operational tempo that was essential to their plan. The question that military analysts started asking by noon on February 24th was no longer, will Russia win? It had shifted to, how long will this take? And that shift in the question represented a fundamental defeat of the strategic objective. Putin had wanted a 3-day war. The failure to achieve decisive results in the first 24 hours meant that by February 24th, no one on the Russian general staff could honestly claim the war would end in 3 days. Some might have thought a week. Some might have thought 2 weeks. But 3 days was already impossible. And that's where we'll pick up in the next part of this analysis. How a military operation that lost its timeline in the first day transformed into a grinding conflict that would reshape the geopolitical landscape. Because once you're in a war that's supposed to be finished in 72 hours, and you're still fighting on day 8, you're no longer fighting for the original objective. You're fighting to avoid admitting defeat. By midday on February 24th, the psychological damage was already cascading through the Russian command structure. This wasn't just about failed tactical operations anymore. This was about a timeline that had evaporated. When you plan a 3-day military operation and by hour 18 you're already 3 days behind schedule, you've crossed a threshold that no amount of additional firepower can reverse. The logistical nightmare was unfolding in real time. Russian planners had designed the invasion assuming rapid airfield seizures would allow massive helicopter resupply operations. The Hostomel airfield seizure failure meant that instead of flying in thousands of troops and tons of equipment, Russian forces were now entirely dependent on ground supply lines that stretched over 400 kilometers from the Russian border through Belarus and into Ukrainian territory. Those convoys became targets. Ukrainian forces had figured out that they didn't need to fight the invasion head-to-head anymore. They could simply harass the supply lines, attack stragglers, and bleed the Russian advance until it became unsustainable. By February 24th afternoon, reports were already filtering back to Moscow of convoy ambushes north of Kyiv. Ukrainian forces had regrouped after the initial shock of the invasion and were executing what military strategists call defense in depth, a strategy where, instead of meeting the enemy at the border, you let them advance into prepared defensive positions, where geography, prepared fortifications, and superior local knowledge become your advantage. The Russians were now advancing into a trap that was being actively constructed in front of them. But here's what's critical to understand about the psychological shift that was occurring simultaneously. The Russian military command in Moscow was facing a decision point that had no good options. They could either double down on the original plan and commit more forces, risking the exposure of reserves and the potential collapse of the operation if the initial wave failed, or they could slow down and regroup, which meant publicly extending the timeline and admitting that 3 days wasn't realistic. Putin's public statement on February 24th evening was telling in what it didn't say. He declared victory in various theaters, claimed that the Ukrainian military was being degraded, and insisted that the operation was proceeding according to plan. But by that point, Russian intelligence services knew better. They knew that the helicopter assault had failed. They knew that the airborne forces at Hostomel weren't establishing the logistics hub that had been planned. They knew that Kyiv was being fortified rather than surrendering. And they knew that extending a 3-day timeline in the middle of an operation is one of the most dangerous things a military can do, because it signals weakness to your enemy and uncertainty to your own forces. What Putin and his planners hadn't fully accounted for was the mobilization of Ukrainian civil society. By midday on February 24th, Kyiv wasn't just being defended by military forces. It was being defended by civilians who had watched their president refuse to leave, who had seen the videos of Ukrainian soldiers on Snake Island telling Russian warships to go to hell with their dying breath, and who had made a collective decision that surrender wasn't an option. The psychological momentum had shifted from Russian confidence to Ukrainian defiance. Zelensky's decision to remain in Kyiv and be visible to the population was a masterclass in asymmetric psychological warfare. Putin had believed that the Ukrainian government would collapse, that the president would flee, and that without a functioning government structure, the population would lose the will to resist. But Zelensky understood something that Putin's intelligence services had fundamentally misread. The population's resistance wasn't dependent on the government maintaining control of territory. It was dependent on the government maintaining credibility and presence. By being visible, by refusing to leave, by speaking directly to the Ukrainian people, Zelensky transformed the narrative from a military defeat into a story of national survival. Meanwhile, by evening on February 24th, Russian soldiers on the ground were encountering something they hadn't expected: a civilian population that wasn't cowering. In some cases, they were actively resisting. In others, they were blocking roads, demanding to know why Russian soldiers were in their country, standing in front of tanks. The psychological burden on troops who believed they were coming as liberators but were being treated as invaders created cognitive dissonance that would have lasting effects on morale and unit cohesion. By February 24th, 20 o'clock hours local time, Moscow time was February 25th, 03 o'clock hours. The Russian General Staff was now in a position where they had to confront a reality that couldn't be hidden or minimized. The first day of their special military operation had failed to achieve any of its primary objectives. Kyiv hadn't fallen. The airfields hadn't been secured. Ukrainian command and control hadn't collapsed, and the population wasn't surrendering. The casualty figures alone told the story. Russian losses on February 24th exceeded the entire estimated losses for the planned 72-hour operation. Equipment losses, helicopters, aircraft, tanks, armored vehicles, were running at rates that couldn't be sustained. The army that Putin had spent 2 decades rebuilding, modernizing, and professionalized had encountered a Ukrainian military that was smaller, less equipped, but infinitely more motivated and fighting for its homeland. And this is where the critical distinction needs to be made. By the end of February 24th, the Russian military hadn't lost a battle. They had lost the war they had planned. They were still in the field. They still had massive advantages in firepower and numbers. But the 3-day objective was dead, and with it died the entire strategic rationale for the operation. A 3-day war justifies itself through speed and efficiency. It minimizes casualties, keeps the international response fragmented, and completes the operation before NATO can organize a meaningful response. A war that extends to a week, 2 weeks, 3 months? That's not a special military operation anymore. That's an invasion that has to be sold domestically as a necessary conflict for national survival. The narrative changes, the cost becomes visible, and the original justification collapses under the weight of its own falsehood. By the evening of February 24th, the international response was mobilizing. The UN Security Council was being called. NATO was beginning to position additional forces on the eastern flank. European countries were discussing sanctions. The window for a quick resolution was closing, and Russian planners knew it. What happened next in the Russian General Staff would have been both predictable and catastrophic for the original plan. They began improvising. The failure to seize Kyiv in 3 days meant that forces were being redirected, resources were being reallocated, and the entire operational framework was being adjusted on the fly. In military operations, this is called losing the initiative. It means that instead of the attacker dictating the terms of engagement, the defender has forced the attacker into reactive mode. By dawn on February 25th, the Ukrainian military and the civilians defending Kyiv understood something fundamental. They had survived the first day. They had blunted the Russian advance. They had prevented the decapitation of their government. They had held the center of the country. And with each hour that passed without Russian victory, they were winning. Because victory in this type of conflict isn't just about holding territory. It's about refusing to break. It's about outlasting the attacker's willingness to sustain the costs of the assault. The commander of Russian forces in Ukraine was now facing a situation where his original orders, occupy Kyiv in 72 hours, were no longer achievable by standard military means. The airborne assault had failed. The rapid advance was being contested. The population wasn't supporting the invasion, and reserves were being committed at a rate that suggested panic rather than confidence. If you want a deeper analysis of how the Russian command structure adapted to these first-day failures and how the operational timeline was stretched and contorted to accommodate what was becoming an extended conflict, there's a comprehensive breakdown in the description that walks through the command-level decision-making that followed. This shift from the original 3-day plan to an undefined timeline represents one of the most significant military failures in modern history, and understanding how it happened requires looking at the specific orders that were issued and countermanded in the hours after it became clear that the initial assault had failed. By the end of February 24th, the equation had fundamentally shifted. Russia still had military superiority in many metrics: firepower, numbers, equipment. But Ukraine had something that no amount of firepower could overcome: the will of an entire population to defend their country. And that will had been proven on the first day. What happened on that first day was never supposed to happen. The Russian General Staff had built their entire invasion model on a single assumption: that Ukrainian resistance would crumble within 72 hours. But by midnight, on February 24th, that model was already obsolete. And the cascading effects of that failure would reshape the entire conflict in ways that Moscow's planners couldn't have anticipated, even as they were living through it in real time. The operational clock was ticking differently now. In the hours after the failed Hostomel assault, after the Kyiv helicopter losses mounted, after the cyber attack campaign had crippled their own communications networks, Russian commanders began receiving contradictory orders from Moscow. Some units were told to advance at all costs. Others were ordered to consolidate and wait for reinforcements. Still others were told to hold positions that they didn't actually control. This isn't just tactical confusion. This is the breakdown of a command structure under unprecedented stress. What makes this collapse particularly remarkable is that it happened despite Russia's numerical advantages. By February 24th evening, Russia had already committed over 100,000 troops to the assault. They had air superiority in theory. They had more tanks, more artillery, more helicopters. But they had committed a fatal error in military strategy. They had optimized for speed over resilience. Every element of the plan was designed to win in 3 days. When that window closed, the entire structure became vulnerable. Meanwhile, Ukraine's population was doing something unexpected. They weren't following the script that the Kremlin had written. Instead of panicking, instead of evacuating en masse, instead of waiting for an inevitable Russian victory, they were arming themselves. Territorial defense units were swelling with volunteers. Civilians were blocking military vehicles with their bare hands. Construction workers were learning how to use Molotov cocktails. This wasn't a military response anymore. This was a civilizational response. President Volodymyr Zelensky's decision to stay in Kyiv had a ripple effect that the Kremlin hadn't predicted. When the leader of a country announces that he will not flee, when he posts videos showing himself walking through the capital, when he tells his people that he needs ammunition, not a ride out of the country, that sends a signal that filters down through every level of the military and civilian population. It says, "We are not defeated. We are not surrendering. We are fighting." By the end of that first day, Russian field commanders were facing a problem that no amount of firepower could solve. They had overwhelming numerical superiority, but they couldn't convert that superiority into territorial control because they couldn't pacify the spaces they occupied. Every position they held had to be defended against an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere. The insurgency had begun before the initial invasion had even truly consolidated. What we're looking at here is a fundamental mismatch between operational theory and operational reality. Russian planners had studied military campaigns, some going back to World War II, others more recent, and they had identified a pattern: rapid advances, decapitation of leadership, installation of a compliant government, all within a compressed time frame. It had worked, or appeared to work, in parts of Georgia. It hadn't worked in Afghanistan. It wasn't working in Ukraine. The specific reason it wasn't working had everything to do with lessons learned from previous Russian operations. Ukraine had studied those campaigns closely. They had learned from the mistakes made in Georgia. They understood that the moment of greatest vulnerability wasn't during the invasion itself. It was during the consolidation phase, when the invading army becomes an occupying force. So Ukraine's strategy was deliberately designed to prevent that transition from ever happening. By midnight on February 24th, the first truly critical window had passed. Russia had lost the chance to achieve a quick knockout, and every hour that passed after that moment made a quick victory exponentially less likely. The longer the conflict stretched, the more time NATO had to begin supplying Ukraine with weapons. The longer it stretched, the more Ukrainian soldiers could be trained and organized. The longer it stretched, the more international support would crystallize around Ukraine's cause. This is where we see the intersection of military failure and strategic miscalculation. Russian planners had assumed, or perhaps hoped, that Western countries would view Ukraine as a lost cause within the first 48 hours. That assumption proved catastrophically wrong. By February 25th, the international response was already beginning to mobilize. Weapons were being moved into position. Financial assistance was being prepared. Political consensus was crystallizing. The failure of the first day, therefore, wasn't just a Russian military failure. It was a Russian strategic failure that cascaded across the entire geopolitical architecture that the Kremlin had assumed was stable. Russia had bet everything on speed, and when speed failed, the entire strategy collapsed like a structure built on sand. The invasion of Ukraine was no longer a military operation that would be resolved through military means within a compressed time frame. It had become something much more complicated and much more dangerous. What's critical to understand about this moment is that nothing that happened after February 24th evening would have happened the same way if the first day had gone according to Russia's plan. If Kyiv had fallen, if Zelensky had been captured or killed, if the decapitation strike had succeeded, if the Ukrainian military had collapsed in the first 72 hours, then the entire trajectory of the conflict would have been fundamentally different. But none of that happened. And because none of it happened, Ukraine had time. Time to organize, time to fight, time to transform what appeared to be an inevitable defeat into something far more complex. And in warfare, as in most things, time is often the most precious commodity. The moment you lose it, you can never get it back. The broader lesson here, the one that extends beyond Ukraine, beyond this specific invasion, beyond even this decade, is that military planning based on assumptions about how populations will respond to conflict often fails catastrophically. History is littered with examples. Invasion plans that assumed passive populations, occupations that anticipated cooperation, military offensives that expected surrender. And again, reality has proven more complex, more resistant, and more unpredictable than any planning document could anticipate. Russia didn't lose the war on February 24, 2022. The conflict would continue for years. But Russia did lose something irreplaceable on that day, the possibility of a rapid, decisive victory. And once that possibility was gone, the entire structure of Russian strategic planning had to be rebuilt from the ground up. That reconstruction would take weeks. That reconstruction would fail repeatedly. And by the time Moscow's planners began to understand the true scale of what they were facing, Ukraine's defenders had already secured the breathing room they needed to fight back. If you want to understand the specific ways that Russian command structures adapted or failed to adapt to these catastrophic intelligence failures, the detailed tactical breakdown is available in the description and pinned comment. It walks through the specific communication failures, the contradictory orders, and how individual field commanders had to make split-second decisions with incomplete information while their entire operational framework was falling apart in real time. The question that haunts any analysis of that first day is whether a different first day was ever actually possible. Could the Russian General Staff have planned differently? Could they have anticipated the population response? Could they have structured the invasion in a way that would have achieved their political objectives faster? The answer to those questions requires understanding not just military strategy, but also the psychology of how institutions plan for the future when the future refuses to cooperate with their assumptions. What we learned on February 24, 2022, was that assumptions about military outcomes, about population behavior, about the durability of command structures under stress, all of those assumptions can be tested and found wanting, and when they are found wanting, the entire structure built on top of them becomes vulnerable. It doesn't matter if you have more tanks. It doesn't matter if you have air superiority. It doesn't matter if you have numerical advantages across every metric. If your fundamental assumption about how the population will respond to your invasion is wrong, then every subsequent decision based on that assumption becomes a building block in your own defeat. The deeper analysis of how this rippled through Russian strategic planning in the weeks and months that followed, the specific orders that were changed, the reinforcements that were redirected, the timeline that was completely rewritten, that's available in the full breakdown in the channel description. It's a masterclass in how military institutions respond when their operational assumptions collapse. Because that's what happened. In real time, on day one. By the time February 25th dawned, the war had already been defined. Not in Ukraine's favor necessarily. The outcome was still completely uncertain. But it had been defined as a different kind of war than the one Russia had planned for. It was no longer a 72-hour operation. It was no longer a strategic decapitation followed by rapid consolidation. It was a prolonged conflict with an uncertain endpoint, and an enemy population that had already proven it would not go quietly. For anyone serious about understanding how modern warfare actually works, how operational plans collapse under contact with reality, how populations respond to invasion, and how the first hours of a conflict can define the entire trajectory of what comes after, you need to dive deeper into the command-level decision-making and the specific intelligence failures that cascaded through the Russian system. Check the description and the pinned comment for that full analysis, and you'll see how this first day actually determined almost everything that happened in the months that followed. The collapse of the Russian invasion plan wasn't the result of a single moment or a single decision. It was the result of multiple assumptions failing simultaneously while under the pressure of real-time combat operations. And that's a lesson that extends far beyond Ukraine. It's a lesson about how institutions plan, how they respond to failure, and what happens when they discover that their fundamental understanding of the problem they're trying to solve was wrong from the beginning. Thank you for watching. If you found this analysis valuable, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss a breakdown like this one. Hit the like button if the tactical detail resonated with you, and activate the notification bell so you're alerted the moment we publish new content on modern warfare, military strategy, and the real-world operations that shape our world. We'll see you in the next one. End of script, Part 4. Complete.